Your support helps us bring you programs you love. Go to wyomingpbs.org, click on Support, and become a sustaining member or an annual member. It's easy and secure. Thank you.
Main Street, Wyoming is made possible by Kennecott Energy Company, proud to be part of Wyoming's future in the coal and uranium industries, which includes exploration, mining, and production. And the Wyoming Council for the Humanities, enriching lives of Wyoming people through the study of Wyoming history, values, and ideas.
In 1870, the Union Pacific Railroad announced its decision to employ Chinese workers along its rail sections. What followed was bigotry, massacre, and finally the elimination of this group of workers from the southwest corner of our state. We're here on location in Evanston to see where historians and archaeologists are piecing together the lives of these Chinese immigrants during their years here. Join us on Main Street, Wyoming to see history recreated, the Chinese in southwestern Wyoming.
She's just an absolutely beautiful bird.
The rainy season is yellow blossoms never touched by yellow.
Our story about the Chinese in southwestern Wyoming begins at an archaeological excavation site at Fort Bridger. The first documentation of Chinese in the state occurred here. Historical archaeologist Dudley Gardner teaches at Western Wyoming College and has directed numerous archaeological digs in this corner of the state, including the Fort Bridger site.
This is the oldest continually occupied site in southwest Wyoming, and technically right here at this place, the entire history of southwest Wyoming is contained. There are some manifestations of the history that aren't here. Some of the economics, like ranching, are here, railroading, military, everything is right here at this locality. So almost invariably, anybody that passed through Wyoming in the first 20 years of our territorial history or before we became a territory passed through Fort Bridger. Very significant people like Horace Greeley, Mark Twain, they all stopped at this site. And what's real intriguing about it is there are people such as Jim Bridger who had wives that were Native Americans, and it was a multinational gathering place of Shoshone and Utes and Bannocks. And over time, eventually you have people such as Chinese and even later on Japanese people who passed through Fort Bridger and made a contribution to this site and the building of the site.
In 1853, Jim Bridger's partner Vasquez sold the fort to the Mormons. They built additions, including a substantial stone wall. By 1857, however, the fort was taken over by the U.S. military.
When the military come in 1857 and take over this fort from the Mormons burn down their old structure so the military can't have use of it. When the military come in 1857, they bring with them correspondence from the New York Times and from the New York newspapers, and one of those correspondents writes about the fact that there were yellow men with trappers. And specifically what they say in the newspaper is there were a bunch of trappers in this area, and among the people that accompanied them was a Chinese man. That's the first reference that we have to the Chinese in Wyoming. They would not honor this coin.
The only physical evidence of Chinese at the Fort Bridger site are coins, probably belonging to a Chinese worker in the laundry.
It was a very harsh environment for anyone coming here in the 1860s. It was very difficult to live in Wyoming. It was always the boom and bust economy that you've seen even today. So they would move in, they would take a job, they'd establish a community, then they'd have to go on. Now a lot of them liked that idea because they could go to greener pastures, but some of them had just begun to make money, and then suddenly the construction jobs were shut down, so they were forced to either find work as a washer or as a restaurateur or something else to try to make ends meet. The harshness of the environment was compounded by the fact a lot of times they weren't allowed to live in what was called the white part of town, or even here at Fort Bridger they weren't allowed to live in the better substantial buildings. They were put at the periphery, like at the town of Merrill, which was a service town for this particular fort. The launderers were behind where we're standing right here, and probably they were allowed in the laundry area, but even there was some segregation. So it was a harsh environment, not just because of the climate, but because of the prejudice that was extended towards Chinese by the first inhabitants of the territory of Wyoming.
Although individual Chinese ventured into Wyoming during those years, it was the building of the Transcontinental Railroad that brought them in by far larger numbers.
We're standing on top of the Union Pacific Railroad grade that was constructed in 1868. In 1868, when Union Pacific came through, they decided that what they were going to do is get this through as fast as possible because they received federal loans and money for the amount of tracks that they laid. So they rushed through southwestern Wyoming as quick as possible. It's kind of funny. Everybody wants to get out of southwestern Wyoming too quickly. Unfortunately, when they built the grade through here, they found that they hadn't constructed it properly, so they had to come back and reconstruct it. In fact, in the first year, there were major disasters that took place. Muddy Creek overflew, it wiped out large sections of the railroad grade, and here at Hampton, they had to redo large sections of the original railroad that they put in place. Who was going to do that? A lot of the workers had gone back home. They were paid high wages for putting in the railroad, and Union Pacific was strapped for cash. So what they hit upon was the idea of bringing in large amounts or large numbers of Chinese laborers to work on the Union Pacific main line. And here at Hampton, they had a small Chinese village. It was segregated from the main part of town. In the main part of town, you had the foreman and his wife and a couple of other Anglo families. Actually, they were either Irish, English, or sometimes Swedish, but there were also a few American families that were up and down the main line. To the north side of town was the Chinatown, and in the Chinatown, people lived in subterranean structures. They literally dug into the ground and lived inside that part of town. It's interesting because very few people wanted to live here. There was a lot of employment throughout the nation. You could work in factories in the east, you could work in gold mines. There were a lot of opportunities. You could ranch, you could do a lot of different things. There was a shortage of laborers. Maybe not so much a shortage of laborers, but a shortage of people who would work for very little. And here at this almost inhospitable place called Hampton, Chinese workers came in large numbers.
The Chinese population numbers in Hampton varied between 10 and 100. Today, the remnants of this 19th century community are strewn across the prairie, disturbed only by wind and wildlife.
There's all handwork up and down this main line here, and so they would use shovels, and they used picks, and they'd use the Fresno that was drawn by horses and mules, and everything was labor intensive. At this particular place, they left a pretty large crew here. The Union Pacific left a pretty large crew at this point, and they'd move them up and down, but every 6 miles there was a section camp. So 6 miles to the east of here, 6 miles to the west of here, there would be a section camp. All those Chinese were tied to the community of Evanston, or as you go further to the east to Rock Springs, as you go further to the east, the Chinese community of Carbon. And they probably stayed here, probably the longest that anyone stayed here was maybe 15 to 20 years, one individual.
Although this site has not been excavated, there is still a great deal we know about the daily lives of the Chinese living here.
So you would have probably 4 people living in a dugout. They lived tighter than we do. They lived in less space than we do. They were used to that in China. They needed less space. In fact, they felt a little bit uncomfortable with the wider open spaces, so they lived clustered in community. The one thing that the Chinese did was have community. There's been a lot of discussion about what makes Wyoming special today, and that's a sense of community. And some people say that if you don't have community, you're impoverished. The Chinese quickly understood that to succeed in the States, they had to develop community. So they would order themselves that way. One person would stay back here and cook for the other men that went out and worked on the Muddy Creek cut, or that worked replacing rails, or worked in repairing the railroad grade. Another person might stay here and be a barber or do the service industry like laundering. But they divided themselves along divisions of labor like that. The very young, people between 13 and 15 years of age, would be the ones that would be home cooking, or the very old, the people who were having difficulty working. And I don't know how this would affect them over the long haul, but sometimes people that were sick or had become injured not working on the rails were able to stay back and be the cooks and be the people that were taken care of. And community takes care of its own. Well, in wintertime when work slowed, you might have the whole crew go to Evanston, and in the next year they would come back. But that was a place that food and commercial goods were distributed from, and where banking occurred was in Evanston. Out here you did your work, made your money. In Evanston you went and played, even for the Chinese.
We traveled with Dudley to another unique Wyoming location, Evanston's Chinatown. Evanston is the first Wyoming municipality to protect and designate an archaeological site within its city limits.
This Chinatown initially was thought to start in 1873, but we now know that it probably began in 1869. The Chinese were always confined to the west side of the tracks, and Chinatown is in a very constricted area. It runs from the modern overpass to the Bear River and from the railroad tracks to the Bear River, and it was all on Union Pacific property. Union Pacific never sold them the property here in Evanston, in the Evanston Chinatown.
By the 1880 census, there were 300 Chinese living in Uintah County. That included the small section towns like Hampton, the service community prospering in Evanston's Chinatown, and the Chinese workers at the coal mines in Almy. Anxious for work, the Chinese were employed at rock-bottom wages and were met with resentment by the other workers. Tensions soon increased. In nearby Rock Springs, coal miners were paid by the amount of coal they mined each day, 1 nickel per bushel. But the railroad decided to reduce payment to 4 cents per bushel. The workers walked out. The company promptly fired them and replaced them with Chinese. When the strikers tried to return to work at the 4 cents a bushel rate, the company refused to hire them. In 1885, white men in Rock Springs, Wyoming killed 28 Chinese, wounded 15 others, and chased the remaining several hundred Chinese residents out of town.
What happened is they fled Rock Springs, and the railroad conductor was ordered to slow down and pick them up and put them on the trains. They brought them on the trains to Evanston. The U.S. military detachment from Fort Steele was assigned here to Evanston, so they came all the way from east of Rawlins, Wyoming to Evanston to protect the Chinese here. The reason is there was so much anti-Chinese sentiment in Evanston that there was fear that they would be a riot here in Evanston. A Gatling gun and a cannon were set now where the state hospital sits. There was a camp erected the south side of the tracks over there, and this community was protected, but the town grew fairly rapidly during that period of time, of course. The Chinese were then taken back to Rock Springs under military guard and protected inside Rock Springs city limits, but they came here during the massacre.
Not only has Evanston protected the archaeological site of its Chinatown, but it's rebuilt one of Chinatown's most remarkable structures, the Joss House.
In 1990, Wyoming celebrated their 100th birthday, and as part of that centennial celebration, each community in the state of Wyoming chose a committee to honor our statehood, and Evanston formed a local committee who looked for a project and decided upon to rebuild a replica Joss House that existed in our community for many years. And so they began the long process of fundraising and putting the idea together and getting an architect to design the building, research, do all those things necessary. And where I got involved, or the agency I work with, they came to us early on and said we would like to put the Joss House in Depot Square. And that's how it all came about.
The story of the Chinese in southwestern Wyoming was a disturbing chapter in our state's history. We asked Jim how the community of Evanston decided to deal with this.
That sentiment was there, that we felt bad at what happened. And of course, in Rock Springs, they had the Chinese Massacre. And in Evanston, when that happened, they removed the Chinese from Rock Springs and brought them to Evanston. And it was really a hard time in our early history. It was time maybe to heal some of the wounds, so to speak. Most of those, well, all those people are long gone. There's not any direct descendants from that time period. But as the process started working and they began doing the research that I mentioned earlier and putting this whole project together, everybody really got excited about going back and honoring our Chinese heritage and telling the story.
Historian Barbara Bogart served as consultant for the Joss House project, which was funded in part by the Wyoming Council for the Humanities. Dr. Bogart told us more about the personal lives of the Chinese in Uintah County. Well, now these people were either working for the railroad or working in the mines. Were there families that were here or just men?
It was overwhelmingly Chinese men who immigrated to the United States, and that's true not just in this part of Wyoming, but in the United States and the West as a whole. The reason for that has to do with immigration laws both in China and in the United States. And in the early 1880s, the pressure in California especially built to exclude Chinese immigration. And what Congress did then in the early 1880s was to put a moratorium on Chinese immigration for 10 years. Chinese who were already here were allowed to return to China, but unless they could prove they had property in the United States, they were not allowed to re-immigrate. It was mostly Chinese men who immigrated, and then the United States prevented Chinese women from immigrating. Or I should say, Chinese women could immigrate to the United States if they could prove they were not prostitutes. Now, how are you going to do that?
The wages in the mines were about 4 cents a bushel for these individuals, but we see that they have such elaborate things that they bought or that they had. How did they get money?
Well, not all of the Chinese who were here were laborers. They were merchants as well, and they are listed on the census. And there were several merchants who ran their own stores, who did import business. So there were several relatively wealthy Chinese individuals in the community. But regardless of that, of where they got their wealth, the Chinese wanted to have these things here. There was very little that they brought with them. Dudley Gardner says they might have brought their rice bowl with them, their clothes, of course, and a few other personal items. But all of the really beautiful things that are found here, and we have some on display in the Joss House here, were imported. So that some of the Chinese merchants in town, as they were in Rock Springs and other communities in the West, were importers. And they imported primarily through import houses in San Francisco, but also did some direct import business as well.
Barbara described the situation in Evanston after the Rock Springs Massacre.
The people in Evanston were in an uproar, as everyone in Wyoming was, about the massacre in Rock Springs and the unrest there. And there were enough demands to remove the Chinese from the mines in Almy at that point, that when the mines in Almy reopened a month or so after the massacre in Rock Springs, Chinese were banned from the mines. So a lot of the Chinese at that point left Uintah County. And when you look, we don't have the census figures for 1890, unfortunately, but by 1900, there were about 60 Chinese left in Uintah County.
By 1922, almost all of the Chinese had left Evanston. Chinatown, located on land owned by the Union Pacific Railroad, was burned to the ground. Today, a few of Evanston's older citizens still fondly remember some of the community's Chinese residents.
One of them was Mormon Charlie. He died in his late 70s or early 80s in 1939, and he was one of the vegetable peddlers in Evanston. The Chinese spent time raising vegetables using agricultural methods that they had developed in China, and managed to raise wonderful vegetables in an elevation at 6,800 feet where everyone else just gave up. Anyway, they would peddle them around town in these huge woven baskets. And a lot of people remember Mormon Charlie very fondly. A tiny little man who could balance these two huge baskets on a bamboo pole like a yoke across his shoulders. And several people have told us that when Mormon Charlie was through with his rounds and his baskets were empty, that he would give little tiny children rides.
Are there other individuals that we have that kind of a rich story about, that they know lived in Evanston's Chinatown?
The other person is a woman, and she is known as, her name was Yuen, Y-U-E-N, but she was called China Mary. And we don't know when she came to Evanston. She came to the United States in the early 1860s when she was a very young girl, 13 or 14 years old. But she doesn't show up on the Evanston census until 1910. And no one really knows where she lived before then, but there are a lot of fabulous stories about her. being a prostitute in San Francisco, and she was in the mining town of Park City, Utah, and those kinds of things. We don't really know anything about that. But again, older residents remember her walking around town in her very traditional black satin clothes, and she would allow tourists to take photographs of her, but she charged them a dime for the privilege. And then she kept a big tin can of dimes at her door, and then she would ask children to run errands for her, to run down to the bar and fill up her liquor bottle, or to run down to the store and buy something for her, and she would give them dimes for running these errands for her. So she was also very fondly remembered. She and Mormon Charlie died within months of each other in 1939.
What exactly is a Joss house, and what role did it play in the lives of the people who lived here?
Well, it played the same role that it did for Chinese communities all over the western United States, wherever Chinese settled in the United States. It's a temple. It's a place of worship. And the term Joss house, although we use it fairly freely now, is actually a kind of a derogatory term. And no one really understands or knows what the etymology of the term is. No one knows where the term comes from. There are several different explanations. But it is a term that whites apply to Chinese places of worship or temples. The Chinese word for it is miu, M-I-U-W. So the Joss House in Evanston was actually one of two of the largest buildings in Chinatown that served social and cultural purposes. If you look at the photographs, you'll see that the Joss House, which was a little bit narrower than the replica building that was constructed, was probably used for a number of purposes. There would have been an altar in it, something like this one, where individual worshipers would have come to make visits, to make prayers, to make offerings, to consult the oracle and that kind of thing. It was not a place of worship in the sense of large groups gathering for rituals. That was not its purpose at all. But the building itself then might also have served as a hostelry for travelers coming through, Chinese travelers coming through on the train and wanting a place to stay. They might have bunked down here. In fact, we found a reference in a diary of a Chinese diplomat who took the train from San Francisco to Philadelphia for the International Exposition in Philadelphia in 1876, and he came through Evanston. And apparently he stopped here, and he made reference to several of the buildings, and he made reference to one building that was a kind of a lodge or an inn. And the reason we can identify it as perhaps the same building as the Joss House is he described an inscription over the door. And that inscription is in the Joss House now. It's a huge wooden block with 4 large Chinese characters on it. And the inscription indicates that this is a place for travelers.
The Chinese New Year, with its fireworks and festive dragon, continues to capture the imagination of the entire Evanston community, just as it did over 100 years ago.
The Chinese New Year begins in our calendar sometime around the end of January. It runs anywhere through the end of February. So it varies, just like Easter in our calendar varies every year according to the moon. So does the Chinese New Year. And the celebration in Evanston was a big one. It involved everyone in the community. And actually, the only time that the life of the Chinese in Evanston appears in the white newspaper is when the New Year celebration was going on. And the editor of the newspaper would make kind of condescending remarks about what was going on in Chinatown. But it involved house cleaning, it involved hospitality, inviting guests into your home for feasts, it involved a parade, of course. And what we discovered in the course of this research is that the dragon, the silk dragon that was used in Evanston's New Year's parade was probably a dragon that was loaned by the Chinese community of Marysville in California. They had a dragon. You can imagine these things are expensive. They were built in Hong Kong and imported. And so Marysville had this gorgeous dragon, and they would rent it out to Chinese communities all around the West. They'd ship it on the train, which meant that different communities then had to schedule their New Year's celebration when the dragon was available. But we've looked at photographs of the Marysville dragon and photographs of the dragon used in Evanston, and it was probably the same one. One of the big events besides the parade was that every year, the New Year's offered an opportunity to choose a new manager for the Joss House. There had to be someone in charge of the temple, someone who was in charge of keeping the religious objects stocked, the joss sticks, the candles, the paper money, all of that kind of thing. So that person was in charge of ordering it, taking the offerings from the worshipers who would come in, just keeping the place clean. Well, New Year's was the time when that person was chosen. And the way they did it was unique, really, to Evanston. The fireworks, of course, were a big part of the Chinese New Year celebration. And what they did was they had a large wooden ball, probably don't really know how big it was, maybe the size of a basketball, let's imagine. And they set it on top of a rocket, and they lit it, and they shot this thing into the air. Inside the wooden ball, or attached to it, were the keys to the Joss House. So when the thing descended then, there was a mad scramble for it, and whoever managed to recover the keys was the keeper of the keys, or the manager of the Joss House for the coming year.
Barbara shared what she personally learned doing her research here.
What I tried to find out in doing the research and in putting the exhibit together was to suggest that these were real people living real lives. I think that's where the archaeological excavations can be most valuable, because in excavating the structures these people lived in and finding evidence of the economic and social activities they engaged in, we get an even richer and fuller picture of what their lives were like as human beings and not just as ethnic oddities.
Why didn't I think of it?
The work of archaeology is painstakingly detailed, but the rewards are immeasurable. Gathering the fragments of the Chinese in southwestern Wyoming and reconstructing their lives is just beginning.
The Joss House was positioned so that the people could go in and they would drive out spirits. They would drive them out the back door, send the spirits into the Bear River. The Bear River would carry the spirits down to Bear Lake and ultimately to Salt Lake. So the spirits were taken out of the temple. Everything was ordered here. Everything was tightly knit. It was a tight-knit community. We're going to make an interpretive side of this. We're going to erect plaques. We're going to have it so that when you walk up on the site, there will be plaques that interpret the buildings, the photographs of the building, photographs of the archaeological remains, that you can stand there and look at the way the archaeology dovetails or interfaces with the standing structure. So you'll be able to look down in the jeweler's store. You'll be able to see the jeweler's store as it stood. You'll be able to see where the pig pens were located at. You'll be able to see the way the Joss House was configured over here and where the Masonic temple was. But the idea is to make it into an interpretive park for future generations.
The rich history of the Chinese along the Union Pacific rail lines has been brought to life for us by local residents and scholars. By studying the pieces buried and left behind, we've come to know these people and to more fully understand the tragedy of their departure. Thanks to my guests for their insights, and thanks to you for joining us on Main Street, Wyoming. For a copy of this or any Main Street, Wyoming, send a check or money order to Wyoming Public Television or call us at 1-800-495-9788. Please include the subject or broadcast date of the program. The cost of each VHS tape is $20. We accept Visa, MasterCard, and Discover.
Main Street, Wyoming is made possible by Kennecott Energy Company, proud to be part of Wyoming's future in the coal and uranium industries, which includes exploration, mining, and production. The Wyoming Council for the Humanities, enriching lives of Wyoming people through the study of Wyoming history, values, and ideas. And by Amoco and its employees, who have contributed to Wyoming's history and continue to be active in Wyoming communities and in the state. Amoco, you expect more from a leader.